Hey, Discourse 300. Last week I was in my front yard. This week I'm in my backyard. Welcome. So I wanted to touch base on a few of the readings we've done this week and the discussions we've had. This week we've been reading Some of My Best Friends Are Black by Tanner Colby, and he touches on two of our most prominent citizens in Kansas City, Walt Disney, who of course we are all familiar with, and J.C. Nichols, whose name is all over the city. One of the key points that Tanner Colby brings up in his book this week is the way in which Kansas City solidified racial and residential segregation. Tanner Colby argues that at the beginning of the 20th century and well into the mid-20th century, African Americans did not have equal rights. This isn't that surprising for a lot of us. So not only did Nichols reinforce and sometimes create strict racial residential segregation, he also created the suburbia, right, where I live now. Last week, you all shared your cultural background, so I thought I would share mine as well. I grew up in a small town not too far from here called Sedalia, Missouri. It's the home of the state fair, so I'm sure that you've heard of it. And Sedalia is a rural town with a population of around 20,000. And the most recent census data shows that 86% of Sedalia is white, 8% is Hispanic or Latino, and only 3.4% is African American. Sedalia is a lot more diverse now than it was when I was growing up. That might not, it might not sound more diverse, but it certainly is. In fact, what really created the diversity that we see now in Sedalia is the development of Tyson's. So when Tyson's came into town, a lot of immigrants came as well. And with the immigration, so came a lot of fear and bigotry. A lot of folks were really concerned that the immigrants would steal jobs. 20 years later, it's quite apparent that that is just not what happened. So not only is it a predominantly white town, the median income in Sedalia is just under $40,000. So it's working class as well. That's where I'm from, and that background has really influenced my understanding of myself and the world in ways that I just never anticipated. My mom went to school, she got 2 master's degrees, and my dad never graduated from high school. So those influences have continued to shape who I am. Both my mom and my dad obviously had very different educational and cultural backgrounds, but they both influenced my understanding of the world. Like many of my white peers, I didn't really understand my whiteness. And if I'm honest, I still don't. I'm still trying to unpack what it means to be white in America. I didn't understand my race in large part because the world that I experienced, I was the predominant majority, right? As a white person, most of the people I've associated with have been white. So I think another way to understand this is whenever when I traveled outside of America and I went to Europe. So as an American, I grew up in America. I knew I was America. I had some vague understanding of what it meant to be an American. But it wasn't really until I went to Europe and I was surrounded by global cultures and people from all over the world that I really got a true sense of what it meant to be American. It was only whenever I was an outsider or whenever I was the other that I understood my own Americanness. And that's the same way that a lot of white folks feel. Or if you are any kind of racially homogenous culture where you're interacting with people who predominantly look like you. It can be difficult to really understand your own racial identity until you come in contrast with others. So understanding whiteness and white privilege has been a really slow process for me, and it's required a constant reassessment of who I am and why I am the way I am. I taught at the University of Iowa close to a decade ago now, and I had an assignment where I would ask my students to write a personal narrative about their own racial experience of race, their own racial identity. And without exception, my white students really struggled with this assignment, in large part because they didn't identify themselves as white, really. So they would often write about their witnessing a racist event, oftentimes between two peers or between a teacher and a peer, but they didn't really write about their own experience of race. That lack of awareness of our whiteness is an example of white privilege. In this week's discussion in our class regarding white privilege, I saw so many insightful comments about different types of privilege and identity that I hadn't always considered before. A lot of you brought up points about gender identity, privilege with heterosexual identification, class privilege, male privilege, just a variety of ways in which we experience the world differently than other folks might. The privilege to be an American is another really good example. But one thing stood out to me, and it was often the framing of the white privilege comments. A lot of times folks would say, you know, my whiteness did not work against me when I went to an interview. It didn't work against me whenever I got a job. That's certainly true, but I think there are ways in which it does work for us to be white. So it's not just the negation of discrimination, it's another form of discrimination where we benefit from it, where white people benefit from being white. There was a study recently that took applicants, the same resume, the exact same educational experience, professional experience, everything was the same except the applicant names. And those folks with ethnic sounding names were a lot less likely to get interviews. White sounding names, they were twice as likely to get an interview and even more likely to get a job. That's a subtle example of white privilege, and it has profound ramifications on people of color. A lot of times racism like that is happening unconsciously. There's a sort of unconscious bias, that's a term. So people aren't always aware that they're being racist when they are. There's another example. One of my favorite studies to teach is, it's by Mark Snyder. It's called Self-Fulfilling Stereotypes. And he did a few different experiments. One of my favorite ones is he took teachers aside. And before the school year started, he randomly selected a couple of students. And he said, you know, Bob over here, he's exceptional. He's one of the smartest people I've ever seen. He's gonna do well in this class. He's just gonna excel. You're gonna have to have more challenging curriculum for Bob. Lucy, on the other hand, she struggles. She's behind her peers academically. She's just not up to par. So of course these students didn't actually correspond to their descriptions, but interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, at the end of the year, Bob was well above his peers. He did better on all performance, and Lucy was still struggling. She was behind her peers. And part of the reason why this is happening is because the teacher has stereotyped the students. She expects a certain level of performance or behavior from those students, and so elicits what she expects. Here's another example that might be a little clearer to see, and is my favorite example from his study. Okay, so Mark Snyder took a group of men and he gave them each a picture of a woman. And some of the women were really traditionally attractive and some of them were less attractive. And, you know, the guys who, they're calling women who don't actually correspond to the pictures, but they think they do. So, you know, the guys get on the phone and they're talking to, you know, who they think is a really good looking lady, and they're really friendly, they're really outgoing. And they get off the phone and the researchers say, well, you know, what did you think about this woman? And they're like, she was confident, she was really friendly, she was outgoing, you know, I would love to hang out with her again. And the guys who have less attractive women, they get on the phone and, you know, their tone's different. The way that they're engaging with the woman is different. So when they get off the phone with the less attractive women, the researchers say, you know, what did you think? And they say, well, you know, she was a little shy. She didn't seem that interesting. Probably wouldn't hang out with her again. So part of what's happening is in these dynamics, in these interactions, we are getting what we expect to get. We're sort of creating the reality that we anticipate. It's a really interesting, it's an interesting way of understanding the effects of stereotypes. So all of this brings me back to our readings from this week and next. We've been exploring Some of My Best Friends Are Black, and next week we're going to move on to Jonathan Kozol. Jonathan Kozol, we're going to read one chapter from his book, and he writes a lot about educational disparities in America. He focuses on segregation. He even goes so far as to call our educational environment the new apartheid. He really argues that we see that much segregation happening within our educational system. The chapter we're going to read focuses on Kansas City and Kansas City, Missouri school districts. So you can really get a better sense of how this has been going on for a long time in Kansas City. And, where we go to school is determined by where we live. And where we live has been determined by segregation, disinvestment, redlining, blockbusting, you name it. So Jonathan Kozol's coming up, and then the week after that, in week 4, we are going to read Kevin Fox Gotham. And I will admit right away that Kevin Fox Gotham is really dense, he's really academic, but what he says is really, really important, so stick with it. And I want you to really pay attention to the way he uses data and evidence. So he has got a really different writing style than Jonathan Kozol or Tanner Colby, and all of them use different modes of discourse and different types of rhetorical appeals to make their argument. One of the things that Kevin Fox Gotham discusses is how J.C. Nichols created suburbia. And that's where I live right now. I live in Johnson County, Kansas. And like I said earlier, I grew up in a predominantly white working class town, and now I live in southern Johnson County, which is predominantly white and upper class. In fact, Johnson County is one of the wealthiest counties in America, like up there with Beverly Hills. So it's an interesting place to live in a lot of ways. You can see and really experience firsthand the wealth disparity. I like to say that I'm bringing diversity to Johnson County because of my socioeconomic class. But the reason why we're here is because my 13-year-old son has Asperger's, and he went to school in the Kansas City, Missouri school district for kindergarten and first grade, and then it became clear that he had needs that Kansas City schools just didn't have the resources to provide. So we moved to Johnson County, and he goes to Blue Valley schools now. And on the one hand, the academic educational opportunities are so much better here. I mean, he really has a lot more resources than he would otherwise. But it's come at a cost, and a cost that I feel like is just as important as all of the benefits we've had, and that is a lack of culture. He interacts with people who look like him, who he doesn't experience a lot of diversity at all in his school, and that has really affected his understanding of himself and the world. So my relationship to race and racism and whiteness has really changed throughout the years, and it will continue to change as I become even more of an anti-racist activist. And it's actually in recent years that I felt even less certain about how to proceed with these issues. One of the most important things is really becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable. If we're ever going to really address these issues, we're gonna have to be uncomfortable. We're gonna have to take risks and be vulnerable and really share our values and perspectives and be open to listening. Really listening to the perspective of others. So important here. So at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned Tanner Colby, who argued that in the early 20th century, blacks didn't have equal rights. Michelle Alexander, this book right here, The New Jim Crow, outlines the current position of African Americans. This book is incredible. I haven't read all of it, I should say, right now, but Cornel West, I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he's rockin'. He's one of the most excellent scholars of the 21st century. He's just badass all around. He calls this book the secular Bible for the new civil rights movement. It's a pretty big endorsement. Anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to share with you is the way that Michelle Alexander describes current racism in America and how it's being enforced through the criminal justice system. She says, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunities, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended the racial caste system in America. We have merely redesigned it. I chose that passage because she really gets at a lot of the ways that racism has changed in America. It's still overt a lot of times, but more often than not, it's covert, and we don't recognize it when it happens. I've certainly been guilty of that myself, not realizing the depths of institutionalized racism in our country and the ways in which I, as a white person, have really benefited exponentially from that racism. It's a lot to take in. And as I've said multiple times today, it's something that I'm still learning to process. It's a big deal, and it has profound ramifications in really all aspects of our lives. I wanted to touch on the announcement I posted yesterday as well. I talked a lot about the use of the first person and also about writing and speaking as a means of empowerment. And that is a fundamental part of this course. It's a fundamental part of how I approach writing. It's how I approach teaching. It matters. We are not merely writing essays in this class. We're not merely giving speeches. We have an opportunity to make a difference in the world. We're going to be researching our communities, issues that matter and affect us personally. This is an opportunity to use your voice as a means to make a difference. It is not simply an assignment to check off of a list. It is really through writing and speech making that we've seen the progress we have in the last 100 years. It is through those tools that we make a difference in the world, that we raise our voices and demand change. So, keep it up. Don't think of this as just an assignment. It is an opportunity to become civically engaged and to make a difference in the world. And I think when we start thinking of our work as an opportunity to create change, as a responsibility to make a difference in the world, hopefully we'll find it more enriching. Thanks for listening.